What's up, y'all? That's the Mess back again. Today we're going to start the first video in one of my series. This one going to be talking about Juggalo subculture, their music, their lore, their politics, their philosophy, why it's kind of a religion but definitely a spiritual path, all sorts of stuff. In break from my current tradition of just speaking, I've pulled up the Wikipedia page, and I'm going to do some light reading before I jump into the topic. This way, I have a better segue that'll keep me a little bit more on task, on topic. So, ICP, of course, is one of the most controversial bands. They simply are. And knowing that, they lean into the controversy a lot. So there is, there's problematic elements to what they're doing, of course. And I don't deny that. I embrace some of it because I recognize where it's coming from. These are, two guys who grew up pretty poor, were part of a gang. They, witnessed some pretty interesting stuff. I have Violent J's autobiography called Behind the Paint. He talks a lot about this in depth. I'm going to reference it at various times throughout the series. Today I'm just laying the foundation for what will become the Juggalo series on my page. Next week I'm going to start the series where I talk about AA and the Big Book. So I'm going to be kind of rotating between those two for a while, and if you saw my updates video, you'll see kind of the way that this channel is going to be going, gearing it towards a more podcast feel. Still working out those details, because I really would like to get this more audio formatted. So for those of you listening in, you don't really need to see much. I'm just going to be talking. If you're watching, great, you get to see me read for a little bit before we dive into the meat of the subject. So from Wikipedia, and this is the summary, the foundation for what we're going to be talking about. Insane Clown Posse, often abbreviated as ICP, is an American hip-hop duo formed in Detroit in 1989. ICP's best-known lineup consists of rappers Violent J, Joseph Bruce, and Shaggy 2 Dope, originally 2 Dope, Joseph Utzler. I might not be pronouncing that right. I've never heard it said out loud. Insane Clown Posse performs a style of hardcore hip-hop known as horrorcore and is known for its elaborate live performances. An interesting side note, which is actually not part of this paragraph, the genres underneath their background information include progressive hip-hop, which I think is funny because it's true, but also it's funny to me because they are progressive. I wouldn't say that they're leftist, but they have a lot of ideals that, as a young 17 to 20 something, when I was really getting into their music, helped shape what would become part of my leftist identity and a lot of the things that I stand for now, even though it's presented in a problematic way, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The duo has earned 2 platinum and 5 gold albums. According to Nielsen SoundScan, the entire catalog of the group has sold 6.5 million units in the United States and Canada as of April 2007. The group has established a dedicated following called Juggalos, numbering the tens of thousands. That number could be higher. I really don't know what the number is. I don't think anybody does. A lot of people who are Juggalos are pretty open about it, but I don't know if there's any polls or any hard data to see about that. So yeah, there are a lot of Juggalos, so much so that in some cities and states they have been considered a gang. They were on the FBI watch list. There's a lot to talk about here. Originally known as JJ Boys and Inner City Posse, the group introduced supernatural and horror-themed lyrics as a means of distinguishing itself stylistically. The duo founded the independent record label Psychopathic Records with Alex Abyss as manager, and produced and starred in the feature films Big Money Hustlers and Big Money Rustlers. They formed their own professional wrestling promotion, Juggalo Championship Wrestling. That should be Champion Shit Wrestling, I'm pretty sure. And have collaborated with many hip-hop and rock musicians. The songs of Insane Clown Posse center thematically on the mythology of the Dark Carnival, a metaphoric limbo in which the lives of the dead are judged by one of several entities. The Dark Carnival is elaborated through a series of stories called Joker's Cards, each of which offers a specific lesson designed to change the evil ways of listeners before the end consumes of us all. Joseph Bruce, Violent J, and Joseph Utzler, Shaggy Two Dope, met in Oak Park in a suburb on the north border of Detroit, Michigan, along with Utzler's brother, John, and friend Lacey. They wrestled in backyard rings that they had built themselves. They also listened to hip-hop music, including Third Base, Beastie Boys, NWA, and local rappers like Awesome Dre. In 1989, Joseph Bruce as Jagged Joe, Joseph Utzler as Kangle Joe, and John Utzler as Master J released the single titled Party at the Top of the Hill under the name of JJ Boys, but the group did not pursue a serious career in music. Poverty and a difficult home life drove Bruce to move in with Rudy the Rude Boy Hill in River Rouge, a city near the industrial southwest of Detroit. So, a couple things here that is also not necessarily listed on Wikipedia. It might be further down, but I'm not reading this whole article because there's a lot to go over. Alex Abyss is still directly involved with ICP. I'm not sure if he's necessarily their manager. I'm not sure about the business end of what they're doing. But the same thing with the Rude Boy. The two of them have been friends of ICP for a long time, and as they continue to grow in popularity and fame, have continued to stay close. Another thing that isn't mentioned here or in the rest of the intro is that Joe Bruce, Violent J, absolutely adores his mom. His mom has been a huge support in his life, and he got to a point where he could financially support her through his music. And that's part of, giving back to a woman that he saw struggle his entire life. We're talking these two guys as teenagers, right? 16, 17 years old, had formed a small gang and were running around Detroit, like stealing cars and breaking into places. They were rummaging through recycling, and they would buy Faygo bottles, right? This is where the Faygo lore comes in. They would buy bottles of Faygo because it was cheap pop, and then they would recycle it at like party stores and stuff, wherever they would take it to make a profit. So they would go collecting these cans and bottles and then cash them in for whatever money they could make. On top of that, they got into a couple street scuffles. So, yeah, that's coming up next. So, feeling a sense of home and belonging, Bruce formed a gang called Inner City Posse, which was composed of Joseph Utzler, Rudy Hill, and other friends of Bruce, and a number of other connections he had made in southwest Detroit. Bruce was jailed for 90 days in 1989 to 90 for death threats, robbery, and violating probation. This experience convinced him to reduce his involvement in gang life. Bruce began his professional wrestling career after getting out of jail, and it was at his first show that he met Rob Van Dam and Sabu, two other first-timers with whom he became very good friends. During this time, Bruce brought Utzler backstage with him, and all four became close friends. So this is interesting. I'm not a huge wrestling fan. I've watched it a couple times. I think it's fun. I'm just not a sports person, so I've always thought it was cool that they have done, essentially glamorized backyard wrestling. They continue to do it. I'm not sure. They're getting older. So I'm not sure if they're like super directly involved. They're in decent shape for their age. But it's interesting to note, right? So they started this gang, and they, there's a lot of that gang imagery that's present in Juggalo culture that has been revised, I'll say, to the point that, as I said earlier, Juggalos were considered a gang in some places, sometimes a city, sometimes a county, sometimes a full state. We were on the FBI gang list. I say we because I'm a, Juggalo. On the FBI gang list. And there's a lot of that, presence, right? They call Juggalos a family. We're not a gang, we're a family. A lot of Juggalos have tattoos. A lot of Juggalos have, in some way or another, been involved in criminal activity. Usually it's drug-related. Sometimes it's violence. The violence is what has gotten us branded as a gang. There's a lot of controversy about how, the Juggalo subculture at large has composed itself when several of us gather in one place and people have face paint on and weird hair, and they're all wearing similar clothes, and maybe some of them are like smoking weed and, genuinely look a little bit nuts. And I know because I've done this in public, I can understand why other people might look at us and be like, I'm staying away from them. It doesn't help when people have committed violent acts either in the name of the Juggalo identity or as a side effect of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to spend later episodes diving into their music and different things that they stand for, which means in a funny way I'm going to be listening to a lot more of them than I thought I would. If you would have asked me a year ago, that's not quite what I had planned, and that's okay because I do enjoy their music. It's just something I gotta take time away from. So Bruce becomes frustrated with the backstage politics of wrestling business and begins searching for another career. Back on the streets, Bruce Utzler and Utzler's brother John performed hip-hop music at local nightclubs using the stage names Violent J, Two Dope, and John Kick Jazz under the name of their gang, Inner City Posse. Seeing a need for a manager, Bruce's brother Robert recommended his friend and record store owner Alex Abyss, who established the Psychopathic Records record label with the group in '91. Later that year, the group released the self-produced EP entitled Dog Beats. According to Alex Abyss, Chris McLellan, then programming director of WJLB, declined to play the EP's single Dog Beats because Inner City Posse's members were white. While trying to get stations to play the single, Bruce learned that one of the stations he and Abyss visited would be interviewing local rapper Esham, who Bruce considered to be a superstar. Bruce had recently begun to collect Esham's albums, as he had done with other local rappers. By the time he had discovered Esham, the rapper had released 2 full-length albums and 3 EPs. Bruce met Esham for the first time at the station and praised him. Esham wished Bruce well, and Bruce gave the rapper a copy of Dog Beats. This began the friendship and professional relationship between Psychopathic Records and Esham's label, Real Life Productions. Growing popularity in the local music scene turned negative for the group's gang, which became the target of growing violence. After receiving jail sentences, the group members abandoned gang life. In late 1991, the group had the problem of having spent more money on production than was covered by returns. The group decided that its gangsta rap style was the cause. Most MCs at the time used similar styles, making it difficult for Inner City Posse to distinguish itself stylistically. Referring to local rapper Esham's horrorcore style, Bruce suggested the band adapt this genre in a bid to have Detroit represent acid rap, much as Los Angeles represented gangsta rap. So something that's not listed here and could be a larger discussion about genre that I'm not going to dive too much into: acid rap and horrorcore rap, horror rap at large, shock rap. Those four kind of subgenres are linked together. Some people will say acid rap is horrorcore, and some people will say horrorcore is acid rap, so it's sort of used interchangeably. Acid rap tends to have supernatural, the term acid referring to, like, rappers will say something is fire, acid meaning it burns, but also the psychoactive, right? The psychoactive drug acid, which is really trippy and distorts your understanding of the world around you. So keeping those two things in mind, it was saying that this was very venomous, dark, and, psychiatric sort of, not psychiatric, psychoactive, getting you thinking about the way the world is. Very reminiscent of what some people would call a dark trip if you've done hallucinogens. Right. So, instead... Oh, yes. The group agreed, but not to copying the style of Isham closely. Instead, they suggested using horror-themed lyrics as an emotional outlet for all their negative life experiences. They were also unanimous in deciding not to rap openly about Satan, which Isham often did. So, this brings about a pretty interesting thing, right? I got into listening to horrorcore through ICP when I was about 17. A friend gave me an album. I listened to it. I loved it. I went on to obtain, by whatever means necessary, as much of their stuff as I could. I got engulfed into the lore, and I realized that there was a spiritual message underneath it. At the time, I was not identifying as an atheist. I was more spiritual, into like paganism and stuff. So the supernatural aspects and the stuff that was kind of based on Christianity wasn't really, like, unappealing to me. Even today, it really isn't. I think there are good things about the stuff that they're saying. Again, some of it's problematic. We can have a whole discussion about why the Christian religion at large is very problematic. I'm not going to do that here. I might touch on that throughout the series. But as a kid who had a very loose, presentation of Christianity, because I wasn't raised in the religion, it wasn't unappealing for me to believe that doing good things brought you some sort of a heaven and doing bad things brought you some sort of a hell. As I've developed, obviously, I've reshaped that sort of thinking into, like, heaven and hell being states of mind and not places that you go to, be for eternity. I can't believe in an afterlife. I'm not certain. I'm pretty sure that one doesn't exist. But I also think that if there was any sort of a God, it either doesn't care about us or it cares so much that, like, why would it let us burn? So there's a whole aspect of that I'm really not going to touch because it leaks into agnosticism and deism and stuff like that. I'm more of an atheistic sort of deist, where I believe that, if there was a God, it created the universe a long time ago. We just don't know what it is, and it's been hands-off ever since, kind of setting the chain reaction into motion. Some people might say that's a little bit supernatural, but the way I think about it is, God, by the definition that I employ it, could be the beginning of the Big Bang. It could be the primordial ooze from which all life in the entire universe has spread. We could be in a computer program and not even know the difference. Whoever programmed it would essentially be God. There are a lot of different definitions that fall under the broad umbrella of deism, which make me an atheist. I don't believe in God in atheistic sense. So it would make sense to me that if something jump-started the entire universe, that thing is long dead, and if it was alive, there's no way it really cares about us now. Anyway, listening to their music and then coming to terms with the different spiritual and philosophical aspects, helping shape my politics in my 17 to 21, we'll say, years, really made a positive impact on me and how I developed as a human being. And I will defend that for the rest of my life. I think that they're goofy, as I've said. They're problematic in some aspects. They're willing to point out things that they know are wrong that they've done and then grow from them. They both got kids now, they're family people. They're doing the best that they can with the hands that they've been dealt. They have done a lot of charity work. They donate food and toys to different drives that they've run. They are really, in an interesting way, pushing mutual aid. I've seen Juggalo communities based on recovery, sobriety. I've seen Juggalo communities that are based around religion and spirituality. I know a lot of Juggalos who ended up being some sort of a pagan. So looking at all of that, you can kind of see the way the subculture has been largely accepting of people's financial situations and backgrounds. There's a line in one of their songs where it's like the intro part of the song, where they're talking about how everyone in Juggalo culture belongs. Like, nobody is kicked out, except racists. That's like their thing, right? That's no racists allowed. But they say, we take all shapes, sizes, colors, and genders. So ICP in 2001 to 3-ish, I would say 2005. I'll say 2005 broadly because I'm not 100% sure of the release date, and I'll reference that on an album later that I talk about. But ICP back in the early to mid 2000s was aware enough to say, we take all shapes, sizes, colors, and genders. They were not limiting themselves to two genders, like many of us in society were brought up to believe. And that blows my mind, right? That, like, even I didn't pick up on a nuance like that. And I'm not sure that they were, like, necessarily aware of, like, trans people and non-binary people and all that stuff. But it does my heart good to know that a line like that could sneak in to their music. And then I know trans people who are Juggalos. I think that's cool. Like, I do and I don't consider myself one anymore. But I find that really cool because I know it's stuff like that they point to and they say, ICP had it right, even if they didn't know that they had it right. These aren't college graduates. They're high school dropouts. They're not the most, liberally educated type of people. And I think that's okay. They've had a lot of life experience, and they've learned as they've gone along. It's, as I've said, they, have tried within their ability to correct their past mistakes. I'm going to use the slur here because I'm a queer person. They've used the word fag in the past. They don't use that in their music anymore, because they realized how problematic it was for gay people. When you look at a rapper like Eminem, who continues to use homophobic and transphobic rhetoric, even knowing that some of his fans have been gay and trans, that's hugely problematic, and it's one of the reasons I don't listen to him anymore. But it's one of the reasons I continue to come back to ICP. I might not always love everything that they do, and there are times when I'm listening to their stuff and I'm like, oof, I forgot that they said that. But I'm reminded that in the time since whatever their song was, they have grown. That's not true about every single thing that they've done wrong. I'm not going to give them an ultra leftist critique about how they're not perfect, so therefore they're not worth it. I'm just saying I enjoy their stuff because it has a very special place in my heart and helped me formulate ideas that would carry through today. So, they're not openly rapping about Satan. Esham does that. I don't really listen to Esham. I probably should, because he's arguably the father of horrorcore music. He has said that he was inspired by a different group. Again, I'm not super versed with Esham's history or lore, so I'm kind of speaking out of my ass here. But Esham was inspired by a handful of songs from like the 80s, I believe, that he said are the original horrorcore, and then he just took it one step further and was like, I'm gonna do this as a genre, and that inspired people like ICP and Twisted, and a lot of horrorcore gets attributed to people under the Psychopathic Records label because they really streamlined it. Most people who say they listen to horrorcore, that's who you're going to find. Horrorcore does in some ways also, Eminem is kind of on that, especially when you think of songs like 3 a.m. Kind of the whole Relapse album, there's a lot of horror themes on there. Interestingly, despite the fact that ICP and Eminem did not like each other for a really long time, ICP has said that Relapse is one of Eminem's best works. If I'm going to judge it on a horrorcore level, I agree with him. If I'm going to judge it on content, I agree with him. If I'm going to judge it from a political standpoint, it's total trash and I can't listen to it anymore. But as an appreciator of music, I can also look at that and say, well, I understand where you're coming from and see how the elements line up. There's a lot of problematic stuff, that Eminem has said and done, and most of which he has not apologized for and refuses to. That's just him. We're talking about ICP. After the change in musical style, the group decided it needed a new name. Utzler suggested keeping the ICP initials to inform the community that Inner City Posse was not defunct. Several names were considered before Bruce recalled his dream of a clown running around in Delray, which became the inspiration for the group's new name, Insane Clown Posse. The group decided that they would all don face paint due to the success of their former clown-painted hype man. Upon returning home that night, Bruce says he had a dream in which spirits in a traveling carnival appeared to him, an image that would become the basis for the Dark Carnival mythology detailed in the group's Joker card series. So, that last paragraph there is the end of the foundation for this ICP series, this Juggalo series that I'm going to be talking about. And there's a lot to digest, right? So you have two guys who were high school dropouts, formed a gang, did some violence, got into some scuffles, both did jail time, both throughout their lives have struggled with alcohol and addiction issues. I don't believe either of them is sober. I'm pretty sure they don't drink or do pills. I'm pretty sure they still smoke weed. Regardless, they've had their own personal struggles, and they've talked some about it in their music. A thing I actually really like about ICP style, which I don't appreciate about all music, but I can appreciate it in this case, is their storytelling aspect. Most of their music is not coming from a place of themselves, right? Like, Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope are the narrators, whereas Joseph Bruce and Joseph Utzler are not usually the narrators in their music. They do have personal songs, they do a lot of... they have so many singles and compilations, and they've just put out so much music since 1989. They really have. And knowing that they have a large discography, there's going to be more personal stuff in there, but so much of their music pertaining to the Joker's cards, which is what they call their like main albums, we'll say. Any album that has to do with the Dark Carnival, the mythology of it, is going to be a Joker's card. They also have EPs in between. I think they call them sideshows. That just kind of continues the lore. So with every album that I'm going to be talking about in this series, I'm also going to talk about the EP that followed it, and that'll lean into the next one. So in coming weeks and months, you will get quite the fill about what different songs mean and how they've been applied, as well as where I'm going to point out clearly problematic elements and what's good, what's bad, and, what's just okay. So the main mythos, we'll say, about the Dark Carnival is that's, it's like it said in the Wikipedia article, it's a limbo. When you die, you go to the Dark Carnival, and at the carnival you are shown a bunch of attractions and rides that determine where you will go after you're totally dead. There is a lot to dissect. I am not as versed with they have 2 decks right now. They originally only had 6 Joker's cards. They released a follow-up album called Bang Pow Boom sometime in 2009. I remember that because I was coming out of high school and went to see one of their concerts. They used Bang Pow Boom as a way to clear the grounds of the carnival, essentially, and start the second deck, which a lot of people had suspected for a while. I was one of them. I said it can't be a 7th. It's got to be one of a second hand, basically. They're calling them decks now, which, whatever. But there's supposed to be 6 in each. It would be cool if they lived long enough to make a 3rd deck, but I really don't think that's going to happen. I do see them finishing this deck and then continuing to expand upon the lore through their music, but I don't see it being totally geared towards their longevity. It's just a realistic thing that they're getting old, and I don't know if they have another 20 or 30 years in them to do this. So that being said, they've done it for 40 years now, right? 44, because they started in 89 officially. That's crazy to be doing music that long in the first place. But so Violent J has this dream, right, where he sees a clown running around Delray, which is somewhere in Detroit. I'm not, hip to Detroit, so I don't know the landscape, the geography. Delray's somewhere in Detroit. Violent J has a dream that there's a clown man running around. There was, in the book Behind the Paint, they talk about the logo of the Hatchet Man. I probably should have worn one today just to show it off for people who are watching, but that essentially was inspired by a guy who had really long, crazy hair, and Violent J and Shaggy had joked that it would be nuts if that guy was some sort of a serial killer, so they kind of drew a running man of him holding a hatchet, and he became their logo for Psychopathic Records and eventually Juggalos at large. Violent J has this second dream, of course, where he says he's visited by spirits of a traveling carnival. That starts the basis for what would be the Carnival of Carnage album, which the intro jumps right into. I'm going to take a good long listen to that over the next 2 weeks and get back to you with info on that. But essentially the idea is out of order. The Joker's cards visit you. When I say out of order, I mean out of order in their chronological release. So in order, you have the Carnival of Carnage, the Ringmaster, the Riddle Box, the Great Malenko, the Amazing Juggo Brothers, and the Wraith. Each of them visits you in some way while you're dying, right? When you start fading from life into death, a lot of people have near-death experiences. This is supposedly when you will see this imagery if you are a Juggalo follower, essentially. If you buy into the spirituality or religious aspects of the Dark Carnival. when you die, the Wraith takes you. The Wraith is just like a metaphor for the Grim Reaper. If you're going to heaven, your first sight of that will be that the Wraith meets you with an open hand, right? The idea is like, I will take you, but that's supposed to be your last temptation. Because he's got horns, he will take you to hell. Whereas if you're going to hell, your first sign that that's a problem will be a Wraith with his hand out like this. Like, stop what you're doing, repent, apologize, make it right now, because you're about to go to hell. That one does not have horns. So the Wraith of Shangri-La, which is their idea of heaven, has horns on the album cover, and the Wraith of Hell's Pit does not have horns and is trying to stop you from going. And I think that's a really important dichotomy that's sort of set up throughout their albums. They don't start talking about Shangri-La until around the release of Great Milenko and Amazing Juggalo Brothers. That's when they got a name for it, essentially. Supposedly, with every album, Violent J has had a dream of some sort of image, and then he would describe the character or aspect to Shaggy, who would then draw the image, and that would become their album art. So when you die, you get visited by the Wraith, and he brings you to the Carnival of Carnage, which is supposed to usher everyone into their limbo, essentially. The Carnival of Carnage is the Dark Carnival, and it also is not the Dark Carnival. It's really kind of fuzzy in that way. I'll probably remember more as I listen to all of this stuff in coming weeks. You go through a series of attractions. I don't know what order all of these come in. The carnival is led by the ringmaster. The ringmaster has 2 forks, one up and one down. I don't know the significance. It had something to do with the gang life. And the idea is he leads you astray. He leads you to your demise. At some point you are shown the riddle box, right? You're in a tent, essentially, and the riddle box is like a jester's head coming, it's a jack-in-the-box, and you pull the crank. That's what they keep saying in the intro, pull the crank. And then you hear this explosion in the music and someone screaming. And I think the idea is that person would be going to hell, because the metaphor behind it is if you pop the box and the image of Satan appears, you're going to hell, and if the image of God appears, you're going to heaven. Pretty cut and dry. If you did good things, you'd see good things. Bad things equals bad things. Throughout the carnival, you're shown a juggling act by the Amazing Juggalo Brothers. There's Jack and Jake. Jack is the sadistic one, and Jake is the good one. So, as they say there's 2 intro songs on that album specifically. I think they could have done 2 albums, but they kind of split the album in half as a positive and negative side. So, Jack throw another, Jake catch one more. They'll try to catch all that's in store for you. What they're doing is they're juggling balls of flames. That's actually what my tattoo is. So, I actually have Jake Jekyll. He looks sad because he's saddened by the sins of humanity, essentially. Whereas Jack looks happy because he's glad to be sending people to hell. So they're juggling your sins, essentially. You watch this juggling act. The more that Jack throws to Jake, the worse that things are. If he can complete his act, it means you're going to heaven. If he drops it, it means you drop the ball, you're going to hell. There's all this iconography going into watching at the Dark Carnival your life go to shit, essentially. At some point you're greeted by the Great Milenko, who supposedly through your life has been trying to trick you. The Great Milenko is noted as an illusionist and a necromancer who uses dark magic from beyond the Dark Carnival. and his whole idea is he tempts you with illusions. He's a necromancer in that he's attaching to people who are spiritually dead inside, not, resurrecting bodies, but his influence of control is over people who are spiritually dead and disconnected from, in, their mythos, God, essentially, the Dark Carnival itself. And he's going to try to trick you with his illusions. Throughout that, when he appears in the carnival to show you what your life could have been, essentially you go on a number of attractions that are outlined on the Great Malenko album. We'll talk more in depth about that once I get to it. But he will show you what life could have, should have, would have been if you didn't fuck up or if you weren't fucked up. And then, that kind of gives you an idea of like, well, this is why you're going to hell, essentially. So yeah, like, I find the whole thing really fascinating. There's a lot of, crazy spiritual stuff. When I was a teenager, I was like, man, it'd be nuts if this was real. Violent J claims to have had these visions. I don't want to speak for Violent J. I don't think it's unlikely that he's had weird dreams about clowns for most of his life. He struggled with mental illness. He struggled with alcoholism and addiction. He wears clown makeup. He used to have locks. And he had a panic attack in like 98 or 99 and just shaved his head. And now he has his iconic spiky blonde hair, which is where the memes come from about Violent J, Steve from Smash Mouth, and Guy Fieri all being the same person because you never see them in the same room. Interestingly enough, and this doesn't have to do with ICP, Steve and Guy Fieri have both been in a picture and lean into the memes about it. And I think that's kind of funny. Smash Mouth is another surprisingly progressive band, despite some of their problematic aspects. And I'm going to talk about them at a way later episode when I'm talking about music in general. But staying on topic with ICP, I don't find it out of the realm of possibility that Violent J has had, either psychedelic influences or really intense dreams that have felt like they guided him. I know I've had dreams that guided me in some of my life decisions because I was just so impacted by them. So I don't put it out of possibility. I just don't know necessarily if they were actually visions from God or whatever. That's not important. What is important is that he's used that imagery and he's used that messaging to spread awareness of, living a good life. And their ICP at large is anti-racist. That's something they've been since pretty much forever, as far as I know. They've arguably gotten into some culturally appropriative stuff, which is why I'm glad that, Jay and Shaggy both shaved their locks off. And I'm not sure if that was necessarily why, if they were aware of that when it happened, but I'm glad that it did happen, because they're white, they shouldn't have locks. But they've done a lot of work in their music to talk about being anti-racist, even if that's not the language that they're using. Songs like Fuck Your Rebel Flag, or Chicken Huntin', which is, about hunting racist rednecks. They have a lot of songs about corrupt law enforcement. So, that's why it's funny to me that they're kind of put into the genre of progressive hip-hop, because yes, but no. Talking about the social issues of racism and police corruption and the failings of government, in some ways class consciousness, talking about what it's like to grow up in Detroit and being poor, the work that they've done with mutual aid, doing their fundraisers and donations that they do, their food and toy drives for underprivileged people. They have advocated against, spousal abuse. I wouldn't call them feminist because their music has some sexist themes, but they were on the right track when they talk about, why it's bad to beat your wife, essentially. And the way that they approach their music is something that I think gets glossed over, right? When we talk about progressive politics and leftist politics, it's hard sometimes to figure out how to reach people who don't use the same language as we do. There's a lot of leftist infighting over sometimes petty things and sometimes serious things, but a lot of it is over how to move forward, right? And I'm going to connect this to the music, so it's not off topic, but when two leftists are arguing, it's usually about how we get to the revolution and then what happens after, right? Like, most leftists agree that there needs to be some sort of a revolution. Some will say it needs to be more gradual, more progressive than what liberals, right? Liberals want to, if you've ever heard of ratchet theory is that every couple of years conservatives crank things to the right and then liberals stop it, or maybe are able to move it one notch to the left. But they're in cahoots with conservatives. So liberals are not progressive, they are not the left. Anyone to the left, the actual left, right? If you're looking at the bar graph, if you are to the left, the actual left, you will not like Democrats and liberals because they're milquetoast. And what I mean by that is leftists are so busy fighting each other over what to do to get to the revolution and then what happens afterwards that we're really not doing a whole lot together. Individual groups crop up, we'll say special interest groups, who advance different things, right? That's where mutual aid organizations come from. That's where co-ops come from. If you've ever worked at a job that is co-op, or worker-owned workplaces, stuff like that happens because of leftists. Unions happen because of leftists. And a big problem that leftists have is reaching people who are not leftists. As someone who grew up really conservative and had a lot of problematic ideas until my mid-20s, so I've got a lot of years of experience in talking to people who thought like me and continue to think like I used to think, I understand that a little bit better. My problem with leftists as far as Western leftism is concerned is that it comes often from a place of privilege. There are very snobby leftists who are extremely well-read and well-educated and would talk me into the ground about history and theory. I'm not saying they're not proper leftists. I'm just saying I am the mad at my boss because they want a bunch of vacation time and deny me mine and my sick pay leftist. I am the working to make ends meet and probably not going to retire because I can't afford to leftist. I am the probably going to die from a preventable disease because I won't have reliable health insurance or it's too expensive to pay for the premiums when I initially have to go into the hospital leftist. I am not the college-educated leftist. I dropped out of college. I'm getting a little bit off track there. But the point is, ICP found a way to reach people using their music that I think leftists scoff at, but it shouldn't be scoffed at, because ICP reaches people who come from this quote-unquote white trash, usually, and are able to take a look at themselves and say, do I want something better for me? Do I want to aspire to be a better person for myself and society? Do I want to join a group of people who accepts all shapes, sizes, colors, and genders? Do I want to form mutual aid groups even if I don't call them that? Do I want to be anti-racist and understand that there's government oppression and understand that poor people need help and understand, even minor aspects of feminism to get the ball rolling, at least? Understanding all of these things being spoken to by two guys in clown paint talking about murdering cops and racists, like, thumbs up. Thumbs up, because you were able to reach people like me who didn't realize that I was on a path to grow into a progressive person and use that as a launch pad to get into progressive politics in my mid-20s, and now tries to, when I encounter it, and I don't anymore, which is kind of frustrating sometimes, but I wish I had the gall and the emotional energy to talk to more people to get them to understand their situation from a leftist perspective without using words like leftism and communism and socialism, because that scares people away. Most people will say things like, or they'll agree with the sentiment of a disgust for Nazis, but when you start talking about it as like anti-fascism and anti-racism, their defenses go up, because typically in America, we're so indoctrinated against progressive values that the idea that we could be doing even a smidge better than we currently are in any form and blaming the system for why that's not happening suddenly comes off as this dangerous radical ideology. So I continue to praise ICP and people like them for being able to meet people where they're at. They're not, they're not Marxists. They probably have, I would say that they're more left than not. I don't know if they're leftists necessarily, but their messaging comes off as very progressive. And for someone like me who really didn't understand what I was getting into at the time that I picked up the first album I ever listened to by them, I appreciate the fuck out of them for setting me on a path towards embetterment. Like empowerment and self-betterment and learning to try to join a community. I don't get along with a whole lot of Juggalos today just because I don't interact with many of them. Whenever I see one in public, I usually compliment their shirt and show them my tattoo. And that's about as far as it goes. I have some friends who are arguably still Juggalos. Maybe we joke about it, but we don't really talk about it in that way. When I was in rehab and recovery between 2018 and 2019, I met Juggalos in recovery who were actually doing an ICP-themed sort of big book. When they go to the Gathering of the Juggalos, which happens every summer, they bring recovery there and they do AA work, and I fucking commend them for that because they are reaching people who need it. There's a lot of drugs and other problems at the Gathering. I'll probably do an episode on that in the future. I've never gone, but I know there's a lot of problems with it. I'm not going to sit here and say all Juggalos are progressive and perfect. I know Juggalos who think it's perfectly fine to have Confederate flags and tattoos because they're like, Southern pride isn't racist, and I'm not down with that. You can't have a Confederate flag anywhere on your person when you listen to ICP and hear fuck your rebel flag. I'm not saying you're not a real Juggalo, I'm just saying you have some thinking to do if that's how you're going to call it. There are Juggalos I know who've gone to prison for abuse, broadly speaking, a few. Where I grew up, which was in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. I lived in Monroe County. For those of you who are not familiar, it's semi-rural and semi-urban. There are suburban areas, but a lot of it is woods. And we were considered a gang because two kids killed a cop. And then wrote a song about it, literally describing the murder. And at the time, here's how I'm going to word this. 19-year-old me, knowing that this case was developing and they were probably going to get the death penalty. I'm pretty sure they got the death penalty because Pennsylvania is one of those states that does that. I was not... at the time, I was glad that it happened because I I'm just going to speak from where I was, 19 and problematic. I was glad that that was happening because I said they shouldn't have done that, right? The one guy, it was like a 19 and a 17-year-old, and the 19-year-old supposedly had a relationship with this cop. They were lovers, and instead of breaking it off because the kid was a teenager and obviously mentally ill if he murdered the guy, that's what happened. They stabbed him like 17 times or something in the woods and then left his body there and then reported it or something. And there's a whole lot of it. But that incident made Juggalos in Monroe County be considered a gang. I don't know if that's been lifted. I haven't kept up with the politics of my hometown like for years, but stuff like that is what bugs me, right? Like, I'm against police as an institution. I also don't believe that, like, killing a cop because you're trying to break up your gay relationship with him is the right answer to solve systemic issues. I'm not going to get off on a tangent here. I'm going to say that at this point in my life, I am not for the death penalty. I am going to be careful about how I phrase the next part. I am against systemic abuse by police. I also think this was a shitty decision by two teenagers who did the wrong thing. They did the wrong thing in this case. And that's all I'm going to say. And you can take whatever nuance that you need out of that. Because if you know me on a personal level, you know my thoughts tend to be a little bit more radical than that. But for the sake of keeping this where it's at, those guys did something really wrong and they fucked it up for the rest of us. And I spoke loudly about that. Even if I was misguided about my reasoning back then, I spoke loudly about that. I said, this is not what we should be doing if we're juggalos. I had a friend who largely, she was friends with them. She knew at least the one guy, and was like, I can't believe you would say this, and I'm like, they're doing it wrong. They're doing it wrong. We're not supposed to be a gang. We're not actually supposed to be murdering people. All of this horrorcore music is about expressing our anger and our frustration with things that are out of our control, coming from a place of confusion and anger and lack of control. That's where this music comes from. That's a lot of why I was writing horrorcore music. I was way more problematic because I had different things going on in my life, but also appreciating what ICP has done to advance the genre and advance progressive ideas to people who might not have otherwise been reached by them. And some of them have turned out into really radical, leftist, progressive people, and some of them are milquetoast. And some of them are just nuts, and you're going to have that in every group of people, so I don't judge juggalos at large as being one good thing or one bad thing. I judge the individual as they are and like to get to know them. I'm under the assumption at this point in my life that most people who are juggalos aren't like openly displaying it for one reason or another. A lot of that has to do with the gang issues. Some of it has to do with like interpersonal beef basically between ICP and other rappers, and that's okay. What are all the positive takes from everything I've talked about? You know, ICP has done really good things throughout their life to make up for the fact that they did really shitty things in their early years. And that is something that really speaks to me as a person in recovery, someone who struggled with my mental health, someone who's made some pretty bad decisions and will spend the rest of my life hopefully making up for them and doing right by other people and trying to live a life of meaning and purpose. They really push mutual aid stuff. They try to push progressive politics in the best way that they know how and reach people, you know, in places where your standard college-educated Marxist might not be able to talk to them. And I think that's some cases more progressive than being a snob nose and telling someone to read Das Kapital or fuck off. because that's not helpful. I'm probably never going to read Das Kapital, and I have a copy of it. You know what I am going to do? I'm going to listen to ICP sometimes and be like, yeah, fuck cops and fuck racists. Because it's literally just that easy to get into a mindset of, gee, this system is fucked up and maybe I shouldn't be racist. You know? Like, I think ICP is niche and they're nuanced and they're not for everybody. But I'm hoping through this series that people who are fans of them can appreciate my dissection of what is to come. And people who aren't fans, I hope you appreciate what it is that they're trying to do and maybe get a better sense of, like, why are Juggalos. So in coming weeks and months, this is where you heard it here first. This series is where we will be discussing what is a Juggalo. And to quote ICP, a Juggalo. That's what it is, man. Fuck if I know.